This week, identity compromise at scale, known vulnerabilities still driving exploitation, and backend systems quietly expanding the attack surface. Plus, a few other stories worth looking into. I'm Sean McMillan, Community Manager here at Bishop Fox. And this week, I'm joined by Justin Grace, founder and CEO of Xcelligence, and Dan Petro, Senior Security Engineer here at Bishop Fox. Let's kick things off with identity. This from Security Week. Nearly 1 million user records compromised in Figure data breach. Basically, attackers using social engineering to compromise SSO accounts at fintech firm Figure, exposing nearly 1 million customer records. Dan, what's the scoop here?
Yeah, I think before digging into really the details of the implications of this, I just want to acknowledge how weird of a story this is. So a malicious hacking group called Shiny Hunters, which is a Pokemon reference. So we've got a bunch of Pokemon nerds launched a wide scale attack against Okta, which is fine. That makes perfect sense. That's where the money is. That's why you rob banks, right? So you go where the identity is. That's why you would attack something like Okta. But then at first the breach sounds kind of serious, but here is a fintech company. And so you think, what are the crown jewels here? What is the worst case scenario of hacking a fintech company? PII isn't really it. So even though 1 million customer records is not great, the actual data that's within that is maybe not as serious. There's emails, personal identifiable information. So
Yeah.
that could have been a lot worse is my first impression there.
Do you think that organizations are over trusting identity providers inside their kind of segmentation model?
Go ahead, Dan.
Oh no, please.
As I read this story, it was particularly concerning. We just went through a whole Okta implementation, and so I sort of stepped back and thought about this. And what are the alternatives? And if you look at sort of the cost benefit versus not doing something in SSO or not hooking all of your various assets in, the risk is so much higher from a manageability and identity sprawl standpoint. Can the vendors and Okta, just one name among many, do better? Sure, but this is not unusual. And the benefit of SSO and similar technologies is so much better than managing these things in disparate systems. So, from a business and executive leadership standpoint, I think this is one to note, but perhaps not be concerned about or pull your SSO implementation. If anything, it's look at it closer, make sure it's configured correctly, and you've got mitigating controls in place.
Yeah, not worth
100%.
the apple cart.
Yeah, I definitely wouldn't recommend going back to the bad old days of having a separate password for every service that you own. Single sign-on solutions are a very good thing. Also, it's worth noting in this instance, Okta was not compromised. That's not what happened here. It was just a phishing attack against particular targets that happened to use Okta, and so they had to set up a fake website that looks like Okta and a bunch of JavaScript that can sort of use it. So even if they were targeted in air quotes, but it wasn't really attacking Okta per se.
Yeah. Next up, we've got from TechRadar: forget 0 days, end days could be the most worrying threat. Ominous. Reporting highlights that most exploited vulnerabilities are known, patchable, end days, and time to exploit continues to shrink. Why do you think end days remain such a high return strategy even in mature environments?
That's because they're terrible at patching. Period. Stop. End of story. I mean, this is basic hygiene, right? We still haven't gotten the basics right. We're getting better, right? And especially as the volumes of data. And I think for me, this capability always starts with the assets. And from a CMDB standpoint, what do we know about and what is feeding our CMDB? The problem is every company I've ever worked with from a CMDB standpoint, the finding and the observation is all the same. The accuracy and completeness of your CMDB is just not there. And so then that feeds your vulnerability system, and that feeds your patching system. And then
Yeah.
at every link in the chain, it stands to break down your ability to patch these things timely and then go back to the system owners. So why are we seeing it? It's a broken process to begin with. So attackers are going to exploit it. Using AI, they're exploiting it even more, thus exacerbating the issue.
Yeah, I
Dan.
think that we sometimes like to refer to the software update button as the "Would you like to maybe break everything" button, and I think that like in security, we sometimes lose sight of that. That it's really easy
Yeah.
from a security standpoint to say like you should be using the latest version of everything possible the moment that it's available. But the reality is that sometimes you update the thing and then everything breaks.
Yeah.
And so like there's going to be some lag in updating timetables, even for teams that are really on top of everything, because you just have to do some tests to make sure that it's not completely broken first. So like that's a thing. Just some realities of software are just that, like it's going to take some time to properly test stuff in an organized sort of enterprise.
Yeah.
The second thing I would say is that this might be relevant later. Again, might be a refrain, but software is not an asset; it's a liability. uh, that like you want software, it's a thing that we used. You want the capabilities that it gives you, but the software itself is not on your side. It's a thing that rapidly atrophies and breaks over time. Uh, and so the more that you can do to just have less of it in general is probably a good thing.
So you're definitely a half empty person. I'm a half full person. I see it as an asset, but I totally get it. I agree with what you're saying. But there are absolutely these risks that come, and I think it does emphasize the point of staying on top of things as they're coming out, because they're going to come faster and more furious, and the
Yeah.
attackers our timelines are decreasing.
Yeah. Up next, we've got from TechRadar. Huge one-fly data breach sees traveler IDs and payment details leaked. An unsecured Elasticsearch instance tied to internal services exposed traveler information, payment data, and authentication tokens. How often does stuff like this happen in your experience, Dan?
So so the tech there's like again there's the technical underpinnings of this, of like PII leaked in some API or like Elasticsearch instance that maybe nobody knew existed, is the sort of thing that's like the general hum of vulnerabilities you see. I did want to call out, however, I was not a huge fan of this article. Maybe we could bring it up.
Oh,
So
hot take from
I
Dan
know
P.
it's a hot take alert. So one, it says, the records include people's names, date of births, ID, document details, flight numbers, ticket prices, details, destination airports, full credit card numbers, and JWT tokens. So one, I read this and I think JWT tokens. That's like saying PIN number. The T in JWT
Oh
is
yeah,
tokens. So like I already kind of look at this and I hate it. But also it like says like the full payment data in clear text and like in scare language was leaked. But like, what do you mean in clear text? Are you supposed to hash your customer data? Like these aren't passwords. You can't just like hash people's date of births and flight numbers. And like
yeah,
cryptography is not magic fairy dust. You can't just like sprinkle it in the database and say, well, no one can ever get this unencrypted now. Like, so at some point, some system is going to need it unencrypted, and if that
right,
is accessed insecurely, then Bob's your uncle. And this is again the sort of thing that like isn't immediately of concern. I think that like the like PII is always out there. We've seen so many PII leaks at this point that like you get desensitized to it. But
yeah,
I think it's serious, but not like internet breaking sort of scale.
Yeah, and I think for me, the article sort of spoke to the fact that we're probably going to see a lot more, and we are seeing the rise of APIs and hooking into our systems and making them more interoperable. Therefore, it is important, it is vital that we've got a really good, secure product development and life cycle process, really making sure that we're testing for things like this. This is just pounded away in all of the testing that comes as you release. And this shouldn't have been shipped. This shouldn't have gone out the door. So where was the root cause failure when they were publishing this API? The other thing that this illustrated, I think, is just sort of the segmentation. If this was an internal API, how, why was it exposed? And again, sort of in the testing of it, is making sure that these things have the right barriers and boundaries, and even if it does get out, that it's sort of protected from a network and a segmentation standpoint.
Yeah. Let's see. Next from Security Week, CISA warns of exploited SolarWinds, Notepad++ Microsoft vulnerabilities. Multiple enterprise software vulnerabilities were added to CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities list, confirming that it's actually in the wild now. If an attacker gains access to monitoring or management infrastructure, what opens up from there? What can you do?
Yeah, and this will be a great one for Dan from an offensive security
Yeah.
standpoint. What can you do? But this is the classic covering up your tracks, right? And deleting the logs, and but I think broadly speaking, if it is sort of in the previous story, we talked a little bit about the threats coming out, and making sure that you're sort of staying on top of basic hygiene of, as these things come out from a threat intel standpoint, looking at your environment, scanning it, and making sure that you're putting in the right blocks, you're putting in the right updates, you're prioritizing those and change control windows. But I sort of see that as basic hygiene that's, again, already broken. But I'd love to hear what Dan thinks, and what is the worst that you could do if you knew that this was happening.
So the Notepad++ hack was pretty unique, and I don't know that there's a lot of like offensive security lessons to be learned there. So that was an instance of like a Chinese state hacking group that had managed to like redirect traffic to notepad++.org, and then was internally, for a very set group of internal victims, changing the updater so that it would push malicious code down to. So it wasn't like if you're a user of Notepad++ and you're not like in mainland China in one of those like groups that they were specifically attacking, then like nothing happened for your machine. So, and that's also not the sort of attack that like your red team is going to be able to perform. So there's just not a lot of lessons to be learned there, other than like from a security engineering perspective, I like put in some more like code signing checks, that sort of thing. That's exactly what Notepad++ did. As far as like SolarWinds, like, these are the sorts of tools that, are of use to large enterprises. And so they're going to be of use to red teams. So showing them up on the KEV list, the known exploited vulnerabilities list, is just a sign that like that is a commonly used enterprise piece of software. I don't think it suggests much more than that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mean to say that these things are vulnerable and therefore you shouldn't use them. That isn't the takeaway. The takeaway is just that you get on that list because you're popular and because you become a target. You get a target on your back.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. From Cybersecurity News, hackers actively scan Citrix Nextscaler infrastructure. This, in summary, is researchers that observed large-scale internet scanning targeting exposed Citrix login portals as a part of a pre-exploitation recon. How often do you discover exposed login panels that clients didn't even realize were reachable?
Yeah, so that happens all the time. We have we're always on the lookout for like some orphaned piece of infrastructure, like there's Timmy's 13th birthday party.com that is like, for some reason, stood up in the data center and gives you right there, and it's tragically insecure. That's like the exact kind of vulnerability that we're always sort of on the hunt for a lot of our customers. That said, in terms of what can you do about, or what is the takeaway from like large scale internet scanning activities, there's just not a ton to be done there, in the sense that like if you're on the internet, if it's publicly accessible, you're being scanned constantly. That's just the background hum. That's just the level of exposure you get for being on the internet. So I don't know that necessarily it means that like if you see one of these scans, you should start to take action based off of it. If you did that, your phone would just be ringing off the hook.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think if you mean to put it on the internet, then great. There standard controls and things that you would expect to see to mitigate for this sort of thing. I've seen a lot of my clients that didn't mean for something to be internet facing, or Dan, to your point, didn't mean it to be internet facing for that long. And so then it came down to a question of, hey, did we test it? Was that a configuration? And how would we have even known? Are we scanning our own environment to make sure that the things that we mean to be internet facing are? And then if and if it's a life cycle issue, making sure that we're retiring those assets, decomming them in a period of time. This is hard stuff, though, with an estate the size of any typical Fortune 500. So this is again it kind of comes down to good hygiene, good inventory, but it's hard. This is hard stuff.
Deleting a server from the internet is always a valid remediation.
Yeah,
That's right.
when in doubt.
Yeah. It can also bring down the business. And,
right.
Yeah.
And then next up, we have Shadow Infrastructure from Dark Reading. Zombie projects rise again. Get it? To undermine security. This is abandoned or poorly maintained legacy systems continue introducing risk due to weak ownership and lifecycle management. So the root issue here, are we talking tooling, ownership ambiguity, governance? Like, who's on the line here? Who owns this?
Yeah, there's I would say there's a relevant XKCD for this. There's the Nebraska relevant XKCD. It's kind of a software supply chain question around like, how do you manage all of the dependencies for a project that is important to business? Anything of complexity worth having as a business like piece of functionality has an incredibly complicated software supply chain these days. And so, like, how do you know that there isn't some core component within that is utterly abandoned, riddled with vulnerabilities, and will never get fixed? And that's worse. If it's open source, that's one thing. You can deal with that. You can try to fix this yourself. There's ways of upgrading it. If that's a piece of proprietary software, if this is some like a piece of abandonware, or if this is some like API that is only accessed via legacy systems now, that becomes a lot harder because now you have very little visibility into how to actually improve that system entirely.
Yeah. And this just reminds me of the previous article around assets that you didn't know were there, or you're trying to end of life them, and you're trying to manage them through end of life. I think the one piece I'll add is, and we see this a lot with big regulated industries, financial services, healthcare, even manufacturing, life sciences, is they put assets into play that are used for a very long time, especially in the manufacturing environment. The useful life, and making sure that there is a plan for upgrading them, and that somebody is accountable, whether it be the business or a governing function that's reported consistently, and that things are end of life in a very structured approach. And if they can't be end of life, then you understand that what needs to be put in place around that to protect those core assets. But things are easy to put into play, into production. They're hard to decom them, and then they're even harder to modernize. When you're trying to think about how we're going to do it better. So knowing that going in gives you the mindset of like, hey, we're putting this into production now. What are we going to do when the next best thing comes along, or when this goes end of life, or when it goes out of support? Really having that conversation in advance is a good technique.
And finally, we have from the Cyber Express, Chinese bots drive traffic surge to Lanzhou website. Reporting describes a surge of automated traffic attributed to bot activity, raising questions about intent and signaling. So could traffic surges like this realistically be used to mask reconnaissance or staging elsewhere in an environment?
Dan, I'll kick it to you. Go ahead,
sure.
please.
Yeah, I get this is another one of those headlines that is just deeply weird because the unusual activity was first identified in a number of Chinese language paranormal activity websites. So we're talking like ghost websites that I guess saw like doubled their like average viewership numbers for some time, and then eventually discover that these were bot activities. So doubling is, for a Chinese language ghost site, is probably not a ton of traffic, for one, and probably not indicative of anything necessarily malicious. I would guess that like somebody's building a scanner and they figured that this would be a good place to test it against.
They're really
So
into
like
the paranormal.
yeah. So that's kind of what it seems to be. Obviously, I don't have any particular information about, in this particular instance, like what actually is going on. But yeah, I would guess that it's somebody's building a scanner. Maybe that's a wide, like internet scale sort of scanner, or maybe it's something more targeted, and they're just trying it out on a number of sites that they're familiar with. Maybe they happen to be ghost enthusiasts and are scanning some sites that they're aware of. So that was the first thing that jumped out at me anyway.
Yeah.
And more, maybe more broadly speaking, extrapolating from this one example, when you see spikes in one part of your network as a big company, you're always asking yourself, is what's the real target, what's the real intent, and what what else could be going on here. And that's where I think the constant threat intel is really, really helpful, understanding your network and what you need to protect. And so if there's something going on over here, what might they be going after as a distraction? Pressure testing that and going through the exercises to make sure that, hey, if our resources from a defender standpoint are consumed over here, how do we make sure that we're not dropping the ball over here? So the sort of my takeaway from that was the more that this increases is making sure that you're able to get good coverage if this is a distraction technique and the real target is elsewhere.
Yeah. Well, that's it for this week's headlines. Justin, Dan, as always, thanks for joining and offering your insights.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a lot of
Thanks a lot.
fun.
All right, we'll be back next week with more expert analysis. Till then, stay safe.